The story of the United States military does not begin with aircraft carriers, satellites, or nuclear submarines. It begins with ordinary men standing in muddy fields, holding muskets they barely knew how to use, facing one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen. Before it became a global superpower, America was a fragile experiment, 13 scattered colonies, divided by geography, culture, and fear. What united them was not wealth or technology, but a shared belief that freedom was worth fighting for. In the mid-18th century, the idea of a professional American army barely existed. The colonies relied on local malicious farmers, blacksmiths, merchants who trained occasionally and returned to their daily lives. These men were not soldiers by profession. They were citizens first, warriors only, when necessity demanded it. When tensions with Great Britain erupted into open conflict in 1775, these militias became the backbone of what would soon be called the Continental Army. George Washington, appointed as its commander, faced a nearly impossible task. His soldiers were undertrained, underpaid, and often undisciplined. They lacked uniforms, proper weapons, and sometimes even food. Desertion was common. Disease killed more men than British bullets. Yet Washington understood something deeper. This was not just a war for territory, it was a war for identity, against a professional British force trained for global warfare. The Continental Army relied on resilience, adaptability, and an unbreakable will. They learned to fight unconventionally, used ambushes, surprise attacks, and intelligence networks. Slowly, painfully, they transformed from scattered militias into a unified fighting force. When the war ended in 1783, the United States emerged not only as a nation, but as a military power, small, fragile, but determined. The Continental Army would eventually dissolve, replaced by a new system, a small standing army supported by state militias. The founders feared tyranny, and they feared powerful armies even more. This fear would shape American military policy for generations. But the world was changing, as the young republic in its first tests. In its early decades, the United States tried to avoid foreign entanglements. The memory of British rule was fresh, and the new nation focused on survival rather than expansion. But history had other plans. Conflicts with Native American tribes, tensions with European powers, and battles over territory pushed the young nation into a series of military confrontations. These were not just wars of defense, they were wars of identity. Each battle asked the same question: what kind of nation is America becoming? The War of 1812 was a defining moment. Facing Britain once again, the U.S. military was still relatively weak. Washington, D.C. was burned. The White House stood in ruins, yet American forces also achieved stunning victories. The Battle of New Orleans, led by Andrew Jackson, turned him into a national hero and reignited American confidence. This war proved something crucial. The United States could stand against a global empire and survive. The U.S. military began to professionalize. Military academies like West Point were established. Standardized training programs were introduced. Officers were educated not just in combat, but in engineering, leadership, and strategy. War was no longer an emergency response. It was becoming a science: expansion, conflict, and civil war. As the nation expanded westward, the military became a tool of both protection and conquest. Settlers moved across vast lands, often displacing Native American tribes in violent and tragic campaigns. Forts were built, railroads followed. Soldiers became symbols of both security and destruction. But the greatest test of the U.S. military came not from abroad, but from within. In 1861, the nation fractured. 11 southern states seceded, forming the Confederate States of America. What followed was the bloodiest conflict in American history, the Civil War. This was not just a war over territory. It was a war over ideology, slavery, and the future of the nation itself. For the first time, the United States mobilized on a massive scale. Millions of men were recruited. Factories were transformed into war production centers. Railroads became strategic arteries. Telegraph lines transmitted orders in real time. War was no longer fought only by soldiers. It was fought by entire societies. New technologies changed everything. Rifled muskets, increased accuracy. Ironclad ships transformed naval warfare. Artillery became deadlier. Trenches foreshadowed the horrors of future wars. The Union victory in 1865 preserved the nation, but at a terrible cost. Over 600,000 dead. From the ashes of the Civil War, a new U.S. military emerged larger, more organized, more technologically driven. The age of amateur armies was ending. Becoming a global power by the late 19th century, America had grown into an industrial giant. Its factories produced steel, coal, and machinery at unprecedented scales. With industrial power came military potential. The Spanish-American War of 1898 marked a turning point. In just a few months, the U.S. defeated Spain, acquiring territories like Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. For the first time, the United States was no longer just a continental power, it was an empire. The U.S. Navy transformed rapidly. Battleships replaced wooden vessels. Steam engines replaced sails. Alfred Thayer, Mahan's theories of sea power reshaped American naval strategy. Control of the oceans meant control of global trade and global influence. The U.S. military was no longer defensive. It was strategic. World War I, a new kind of war when World War I erupted in Europe in 1914. The United States initially stayed neutral. But in 1917, German submarine attacks and political pressures pushed America into the conflict. The U.S. military was unprepared for modern industrial warfare. European armies had spent years adapting to trench warfare, poison gas, machine guns, and artillery barrages. American forces had to learn quickly or die, and they did learn. Over 2 million American soldiers crossed the Atlantic. They brought fresh energy, new tactics, and overwhelming manpower. By 1918, U.S. forces played a critical role in breaking the stalemate. When the war ended, America emerged not just as a victor, but as a world power. But peace would not last. The calm before the storm between the two world wars, the U.S. military shrank once again. Isolationism returned. Many Americans believed the horrors of World War I should never be repeated. But while America rested, other nations prepared. Germany rearmed, Japan expanded. Italy sought empire. New weapons were being designed, faster aircraft, more powerful tanks, more destructive bombs. The next war would not look like the last. It would be bigger, faster, deadlier. And when it came, it would reshape the U.S. military forever. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, it was not fully prepared for what lay ahead. The attack on Pearl Harbor shattered any remaining illusions of safety. In a single morning, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was crippled, thousands were killed, and the nation was forced into a war that would decide the fate of the modern world. But what followed was one of the greatest military mobilizations in human history. Factories that once produced cars began producing tanks. Shipyards worked day and night. Women entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. Millions of men were drafted, trained, and deployed across two massive theaters of war, Europe and the Pacific. The U.S. military was no longer just an army. It had become a machine. In Europe, American forces landed on the beaches of Normandy on June 6, 1944. D-Day was not just an invasion, it was a gamble that could have failed catastrophically. Thousands died in the first hours. But they kept coming. Through hedgerows, cities, and rivers, the Allies pushed forward, dismantling the Nazi war machine piece by piece. In the Pacific, the war was brutal and unforgiving. Island-hopping campaigns against Imperial Japan turned tiny specks of land into battlefields soaked in blood. Iwo Jima, Okinawa, Guadalcanal. These names became symbols of sacrifice. American military strategy evolved rapidly. Amphibious assaults, carrier-based aviation, strategic bombing, and intelligence networks became central to victory. War was no longer fought just by soldiers, it was fought by scientists, engineers, codebreakers, and industrial planners. Then, in August 1945, the world changed forever. 2 atomic bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The war ended, but a new era began, the Cold War, a war without front lines. After World War II, the United States did not demobilize as it had before. Instead, it reorganized. The Department of Defense was created. The U.S. Air Force became its own branch, Intelligence agencies like the CIA were established.
Ow.
Nuclear weapons reshaped military thinking. For the first time, total war meant total annihilation. The Cold War was not fought with massive invasions, but with tension, proxy conflicts, espionage, and constant preparation for the unthinkable. America and the Soviet Union stood on opposite sides of ideology, each armed with enough nuclear firepower to destroy the planet. The U.S. military adopted a new role: deterrence. It was no longer enough to win wars. The goal was to prevent them from happening at all. Missile silos dotted the countryside. Nuclear submarines patrolled the oceans. But while the superpowers avoided direct conflict, smaller wars erupted across the globe. Korea, the Forgotten War. In 1950, North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel, invading South Korea. The United States, under the banner of the United Nations, responded. The Korean War introduced Americans to a new kind of conflict: limited war. There would be no total victory, no unconditional surrender. The goal was containment. U.S. forces faced brutal terrain, freezing winters, and a determined enemy. When China entered the war, the conflict escalated dramatically. By 1953, an armistice was signed. Korea remained divided. No victory parades, no clear ending. It's just another line drawn on a map. Vietnam. War in the jungle of Korea was confusing. Vietnam was devastating. The U.S. entered the conflict gradually, advising and supporting South Vietnam. But over time, American involvement deepened into full-scale war. This was not a conventional battlefield. There were no clear front lines. The enemy blended into the population. Guerrilla tactics replaced traditional warfare. American forces possessed unmatched firepower, but struggled to define victory. Television brought the war into American homes. Graphic images, civilian casualties, and growing anti-war protests changed public perception forever. For the first time, the U.S. military was not just fighting overseas, it was being questioned at home. By 1975, the war ended in defeat. It was a moment of reckoning. The U.S. military began to transform again. A military without end, the United States military today is not just a force, it is a global presence. Delivers aid after disasters. It patrols sea lanes. It trains allies, deters enemies. It is always preparing for the next war, even when it hopes never to fight one. From farmers with muskets to pilots and stealth jets, from wooden ships to nuclear submarines, from handwritten orders to AI-driven command centers, this is the story of transformation. This is the story of power. This is the story of survival. This is US military, a journey through history.